Hi, welcome to NDE TV. I'm Peggy Robinson. Today's guest is Jonathon Van Valin, and he's going to tell us about his near-death experience. Hi, Jonathan. So you are on an island. That's not fair. I'm in Long Bottom, Ohio.
It's an island, but it's not maybe the kind of island that people think of when you say, "Hey, lucky you, you're on an island."
You think of the
This
word
one is,
island.
yeah, no, this is not white sandy beaches. This is forested evergreens with an unusual skiff of snow at this very moment.
Huh.
But it is otherwise a beautiful place where there's lots of people live, but there's also things like a lot of deer and coyotes and bald eagles and things like that. So it's an interesting and beautiful place to be for a little bit.
We may be in a similar background then because we live in a forest.
Lovely.
So,
Yeah, I'm fond of that
okay.
sort of thing.
So I'm anxious to hear your experience, and you can start wherever you like and take as long as you like.
Okay. Um, I think we might as well just jump right into it. The experience that at hand here is the result of a surgery that I underwent at 29 years old. I was diagnosed with sleep apnea, which is a little unusual for the average fit, healthy 29-year-old. But that was something that in me turned out to be a kind of medium to severe case of sleep apnea, which means I won't bother, go into too much of the details of it, but it's a condition in which you actually stop breathing while you sleep, which means you never get a good night's sleep. And it can be actually life-threatening on certain ends of the spectrum. The solution to sleep apnea is there are many, and most of them do not involve surgery, but there was many reasons in my own case which made that the surgery kind of the main option. And it's it's a surgery that's known to be exceptionally painful in recovery. One of the reasons people are frequently dissuaded from having that surgery is that the recovery is so awful, so painful. The
I
reason
mean,
for that is that
I'm sorry, is sleep apnea
yeah,
like that, like serious that you would consider like a dangerous, painful surgery to?
absolutely, it can be.
Okay.
And again, the vast majority of people will solve that issue in other ways. For instance, using what they call a CPAP machine, which I won't bore you with the details on, but it's a very common solution. It's the kind of thing that most people do. It's a minority of people that end up in the surgical solution. But in my case, that was just really turning out to be kind of the only meaningful one that would really work. And as far as it being a danger, first of all, there's the dangers of being just in a constant lifelong state of sleep deprivation. That leads to all kinds of possible issues down the road. One of them being that severe sleep apnea can frequently lead to dying of a heart attack in your sleep. Not too surprising in a way. but but all that aside, anyway, the surgery was what was deemed the best, most reasonable, and kind of the only real solution that I was going to be able to undertake. And so I that's the road we went down. And what it involves is removing a great deal of tissue from the back of one's throat and the soft palate and things. Uh, and the reason it's such a painful recovery is that it's a part of your body that's extremely nerve rich, and you have to continue to use it to do things like breathe and swallow and things like that. And so the analogy that was given me, among others, was one doctor basically said, you're going to have to discover what it's like to break your leg and then walk on it, because all this tissue is going to be disrupted
I have an
and all
anxiety
that.
attack just thinking about that.
Well, we're going to come back to that because that you'll see how that ends up being kind of a central feature of part of the story, which is why I mentioned it now. And the so I'm in the hospital for I think I think they let me out on the fourth day. They kind of kicked me out of the hospital, like you're fine enough, go convalesce at home, which was in retrospect a huge mistake. You'll see why shortly as well. And in this case, so I'm 29 years old. I've been released into the care of my parents, my father in particular, who made a particular gesture of saying, "Hey, I want you to. I'm going to come get you. You're going to, you know, I'm going to go out to the family farmhouse, and I'm going to watch over you." And he was very. It's one of the very charming acts of love I will remember my father for. And so, yeah, he was gonna he was gonna watch over me as I stumbled around and recovered. And uh, the one of the complications of this that you can imagine was that the if you've completely had your throat kind of destroyed to to get through this, uh, one of the things that's true is it was essentially impossible to eat, which was not the problem, and in the end, but uh, it's the act of swallowing that was I was nearly incapable of. I could barely speak at all. Like I could at most eke out a whispered word, which was extremely painful. So um, so I'm very quiet. There's nothing to do except stare into a corner or out a window for days. And why I was released from the hospital in a condition in which it was essentially impossible to eat or speak is is sometimes it just without casting needless aspersions, it's just sometimes that's healthcare in America. It in retrospect, it was absurd that they let me out of the hospital in the condition that I was in, but that's how it works. So that's what I did. And over the course of a number of days, and I may have lost track exactly of the timing, but I'm in my father's care for a bunch of days, um, and at some point in those days, on a particular day, it was midday, I became instantly, it was crystal clear in this moment in which the best way I can describe it is there was simply an inner click. I felt this click and recognized this click. And it was in that moment that I could see with crystal clarity that I was beginning to die and the life force in me was beginning to drain away. And there was an immediate recognition that flowed in with that recognition that my body was beginning to die. The first was that immediately I saw, in a way that I'd never seen before, that I was not my body. The essence of that experience was it was as though my sense of self sort of took a step backwards into what's often called the witness. And I could see that my body was dying. And that's what was so startling about it, is that the body was dying, but whatever it was that was observing the body, the me part, that individuated sense of the self, was simply observing it. And it was instantly clear that whatever was doing that observing was not dying. And that was the sort of initial shock to see that I was not dying. And that was separate from this body. And of course, in that moment, it also conferred not only a moment of sort of shock, but a kind of immediate freedom that was revelatory, because what it meant immediately was that the pain in that body was not mine either. So we really are talking about just mind-bending, blackout level pain, knee buckling pain. And to see that that body was not me meant the pain in that body was not me. It wasn't that the pain disappeared. It's just that it was rendered um, irrelevant. It didn't have real effect because it didn't have any effect on this witness. Um, I mean, there was this, my mind was a little bit spinning at that point just because it was such a revelation to encounter that it took a moment to even kind of get my bearings on it. But the next immediate recognition was that that life force that was draining away from this body was draining away at a rate that was relatively slow. Like this was not an immediate, imminent bodily death. This was going to be something that took a little while. In fact, probably a day or two or something like that. And the funny thing about that was that it immediately sparked this notion in my head that like, wow, there's plenty of time, which was comforting to me because the revelation itself was so startling that there was simply a sense of wanting to sort of be able to spend some time with it, which I was clearly going to be given. But immediately on the heels of that was the sort of third revelation that very literally blew away anything, any sense of self that I could continue to attach to, which was there was this tremendous and extraordinarily gentle experience of merging into something that was absolutely infinite and vast. It's very difficult to put into words, but uh, it at the time it felt as though every little molecule of life force that was draining away was equaled by merging into this absolutely infinite vastness. I could call it an infinite vastness. I could call it merging into something that was overwhelmingly universal. I could call it absolute oneness or wholeness.
What did it
Um,
look like?
well, that's an interesting question because it's it's something like if I and this is true of this whole experience. If this is true of that sense of being a witness, let me back. I'm going to answer your question, but let me back up for just a second
Okay.
because if I go back to that very first moment in which there was a sense of I'm not my body, and if I'm not my body, and I'm used to thinking of my body as this corporeal thing here located right here in space and looking out of these eyeballs at this world and things. But if I'm not my body and I'm still observing it, then there can naturally arise this question of, well, then where is this sense of I? Where is it exactly? And can I locate that in space? And the fact is, I could see immediately it was impossible for me to locate precisely. I couldn't put my finger on it. It's here, it's there. And so there's,
Because you were invisible?
it's just that it's unlocatable in space. Um, there's a sense of being in that witness. There's a sense of it in that case being even a separated sense of being, like it's an individuated witness that looks out upon these things, including the body. But it would still be impossible to locate it somewhere physically in space. And so, what I mean to highlight in that is that I it's impossible to say that the physical senses were um, were the best ways to even grasp it. Like if it's not locatable in space, how do you touch it? Well, you don't really. That's not how it's working. It's maybe the best way I could say is that it's this awareness, but that awareness is not dependent upon the usual five physical senses that we have here in this physical space, in that physical body. And that could easily begin to make sense to me because I'm like, well, I'm not the body. Of course, that can make sense.
Were you like
And
a
so
thought?
that's an interesting way to put it. Uh, and I think it's actually rather apt. What I do know is that that sense of individuated but non-corporeal sense of being, sense of self, the one that was witnessing this body, was also recognized on the heels of that initial realization that it was merging into this infinite vastness. And what's powerful about that in this moment for me was that I could see that that merging was going to take a little bit of time because the body was going to take a little while to die. This process was going to take a little while. But as every molecule seemed to, that's not the best way to put it, but as every just iota of being began to merge into that vastness, it was clear that even that individuated sense of self was going to be merging into that vastness, and that individuatedness would lose its individuatedness. It would become this allness. It was in the process of becoming this allness. So now we have a case in which that sense of being is losing its individuality.
Are you
So
evaporating?
when you ask a question like, well, where were you or what did you see? Again, it becomes in that experience, it becomes clear that this is an awareness that is beyond the limitations of the simple physical
Did it feel like you
faculty.
were evaporating?
That's an interesting way of putting it too. Yeah, it was sort of a dissolution, a dissipating. Um, and one of the things I would really wish to convey to anyone that might be listening or that could encounter this at some point in their own journeys is that a part of that merging into that vastness could sound as though that's really what death is. Like that's when you disappear. But I must reframe that because it's emerging into what is all and vast and one. And if it is so vast and so whole and so one with a capital O oneness, then it's all. And if it's all, there's nothing missing, which is why there could not possibly be any sense of loss in it. And so, yes, that sense of individuatedness was merging and beginning to lose its individuatedness, but that was not experienced as a loss in any way. It was experienced simply as an awareness that was the most breathtakingly beatific, extraordinary, beautiful experience of overwhelming, loving allness that I could possibly ever have conceived of. Putting it into words does not come even close to encapsulating the true scope of the experience.
I really try hard to picture my guest experiences, and the only pictures coming to my mind is putting salt in soup and stirring it up.
That's a pretty good vision. And that may not sound all that interesting, to people in a way like salt and soup. That's what are you talking about salt and soup? Um, yes, we are talking about the salt and soup, but that is if the salt is something that's dissolving into the the soup of what is utterly whole and complete. And if it is absolutely whole and one and complete, it cannot possibly be missing anything. And if it can't possibly be missing anything, there's no way in which there can be something broken. There's no way in which there could be a sense of lack or loss
So maybe you were like
or
you were
need.
imperfection, like this could not be a bad thing, like dissipating
It
couldn't be
could not
bad.
possibly be a bad. I mean, and you're precisely correct. It could not possibly have been. I could not possibly have machinated an idea like this is terrible. You're absolutely right. It was utterly and completely the opposite of that. There's no sense of lack. There's no sense of want. There's no sense of need. There's no sense of loss of any kind. And if that is so, how could there possibly be uh, even the slightest tick of fear? There could not possibly be. And if there is no fear, and it's not even possible in this, then the only possible sort of natural default experience then is one that is extraordinarily peaceful. And out of that peace, the only seeming possible default response is something that is very simple and essentially absolutely and purely simply loving.
Did it feel like a rescue from the pain?
Oh, it was a complete release from the pain.
But did it have a sense of something just protected me or moved me out of that? As if
No.
someone, like there's an observer at all.
Well, again, I mean, it sort of began with this revelation of being the observer, but even that observer is dissolving here. And so it's not that it's like, so first of all, the pain did become irrelevant. And again, I could look upon the body in this awareness and could say, well, okay, there is pain in that body. that's just a that's a that seems to be a physical fact in that seeming body. It's just that's not me. So that pain is irrelevant. It has no real effect. It doesn't impugn this sense of beingness in any way at all. And because it has no effect on that, it's just rendered meaningless. First of all, I mean, that's the first sort of level of release from that pain. Um, but the second, but to be more subtle about that and to actually answer your question more clearly, more directly, the it's not that that I was being protected from pain. And what I mean by that is it's clear in that experience that the pain um, is that the let me start it over. Rather than being protected from pain, it was showing me that in this experience of oneness, that pain was actually a complete illusion. In fact, the entire bodily experience has an illusory quality to it. It's an illusion.
So your
And it's
life felt
something,
very removed from you, like very far away past. Like it wasn't like, oh
you mean
no, my family.
the events of my physical life?
Yeah.
Um, there, those were essentially like a dream adventure, and dreams can be powerfully real and seem very palpable, which is how I think of my own life and my own past and things like that. But that they still, at their most fundamental basis, have an illusoriness to them. And so, if something is illusory, it doesn't have real reality. And if it's not real reality, then you don't have to be protected from it. That's a misapprehension of what it really is. If something isn't actually real, there's no need to be protected from it. And so to your question was, did you feel protected, from this pain? Well, it wasn't like that. It wasn't being protected from it. It was being shown that it wasn't real in a way that required no protection in the first place, which is
So
why
there was no
it's a
like, oh shit,
complete
I'm
release.
dead.
It's a complete freedom from
Yeah.
having to even consider
Okay.
protection.
Okay.
Um,
So like a very easy transition for you.
well, it couldn't have been easier. I mean, was it easy? Oh my gosh. I would say the experience of dying is was it was like walking through your own front door. There's not the remotest slightest sense of effort.
Or regret.
Oh, couldn't possibly be regret in this overwhelming oneness that basically boils down to nothing but absolute lovingness. What's more astonishing is that there could be the slightest notion to turn around, turn away from it and think, oh no, I think I'd rather come back. I think
Which
I'd
a lot of
rather,
people do
yes. And so,
in their
and
NDEs.
as did I,
Okay.
ultimately. But um, the 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 actual experience of dying itself could not possibly have been more extraordinary or beautiful. The everything I've just described sort of came in a flood of experiential realization in this moment, or the moments immediately following this inner click in which it's very clear my body is beginning to die. Um, One of the other aspects about that clarity, by the way, was that because of the fact that that awareness was taking place in a way that rendered the body separate and frankly unimportant, all the things that were happening to the body were seen and recognized and experienced to be um, not having no effect whatsoever on that awareness. So the pain did not affect that awareness. The fact that I'd had various, narcotics throughout this adventure had no effect. The clarity was so clear because all of those bodily factors did not muddy it. They were irrelevant. In fact, it showed that any kind of effect of any kind in the three-dimensional world in which that body existed had the same quality, that it first of all, an illusory quality, and secondly, that there is no aspect of the physical world that could impugn, affect, or negatively impact that awareness. So that's a long way of saying there's nothing in the world that could impact that fundamental beingness, that fundamental awareness. So that's why there is this overarching and extraordinary sense of freedom in it, because it's like being freed from any burden that could possibly be conferred upon someone here in these three dimensions. And I also, in these moments, could not possibly conceive of this being wrong or being a problem. Given everything I've said, it shouldn't be a surprise that I could recognize that I'm dying, but that recognition comes with this overwhelming feeling like, oh, there's nothing wrong about this. Nothing. In fact, you could say this is, the pinnacle of experience I've ever come across ever. There's nothing wrong about this. And in that sense, there was no fear about it. There was no sense that this should immediately be turned around. This isn't a problem. The overwhelming default result was just a tremendous, tremendous sense of very sweet, gentle peace. And so sometime in the next probably hour or so, when my father comes in and, he's busy, he's watching over me, but he's doing household chores and farm related chores and things, and kind of coming in all day long and checking on me. And he shows up, and there's not a single thing in me that is inclined to tell him I'm dying. I don't say a word.
So
Keep in mind also that my
you're
physical body can still barely speak. I could whisper a few
okay,
words.
okay.
Very painful to do it, but again, that's essentially rendered, the pain really is rendered irrelevant. But I also, when he comes in the room, I cannot imagine figuring out, at the time, I could not possibly put into words. I couldn't look him in the eye and say, hey, Dad, I'm dying. Also, it's great. I'm fine.
Do
Like,
you
it just
think you were
wouldn't
in
make
like
sense.
a coma place at that time?
No, I'm absolutely lucid and, hanging out in the living room. Um, um, I could not possibly imagine how to explain to him that myself and my body were two different things, one of which was basically irrelevant. And even less than that, I could not possibly figure out how to explain that I was merging into the infinite, into the all-encompassing oneness. Like, I had no capacity, even if I could speak well at the time. I couldn't possibly have put
Did,
this into words and
did you
tried to
feel like
explain
you
it to him.
wanted to? Did you feel like you
No,
okay.
no, there was, I mean, it was such perfect peace that there was nothing that needed to be done. There was nothing that needed to change. There was no sense of anything being out of place. All I could say is that he came in the room. I looked upon him. I felt loving. That's it. I didn't say a word.
So you were out of body?
Well, again, and I, I would draw a very subtle distinction there. I knew that I wasn't the body, and that's an awareness that cannot be located in space.
Was your view of your dad as if you were still in your body looking out?
It was in that case. Yes, that's
Okay.
true. That is true. Um, at some point in the future, and we may get into this later, I did become familiar with the kinds of experiences that involve um, perception from a vantage point that is not your body. Those experiences had nothing to do with this NDE experience, but this NDE experience, I think, in some ways did prepare me for some of those later experiences in a way that may have been difficult to be prepared otherwise. But so to your point, yes, it seemed like I was looking out of the same two eyeballs as usual. I just knew that that wasn't really who I was, or that wasn't really the seat of that beingness, and that was unequivocally clear and utterly unnecessary to try to express it in that moment. Um, Everything was perfectly fine, just the way it was. So he kind of came and checked on me all afternoon, and and it was a normal. I wasn't doing much. There wasn't much for me to do other than sit and stare out windows, and it was an extremely quiet, overwhelmingly peaceful day that I was essentially reveling in the awe of what I was experiencing, and um, and that was about it. And it was a revelation because I was essentially released from the suffering. One of the ways I would put it is that it was in this instance, this was the first instance, not the last, it turns out, but it was the first instance of my life at that point in which I got to see the difference between pain and suffering. Again, there was there pain in that physical body? Yes, but I was not suffering it at all. What an extraordinary release that would be was, and so I just kind of sat and reveled in this all the rest of the day. Eventually, the evening came, and throughout this surgery and throughout this recovery and throughout all this pain and all this, I hadn't had a good night's sleep for many, 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 many days. And for the first time in all of those days, it was very apparent that I might actually get to go to sleep. I might be able to, this body could rest a little. And that seems like a great thing for it. And so I thought, I'm going to go to sleep. This is going to be really interesting. And as, and I did so, and I did sleep for the first time in days. And when I woke up, I'd wake up somewhat periodically, and every time I woke up, I would sort of check in with this experience. Am I still dying? Yes, I am. Is this experience still going? Yes, it is. Is that merging with the infinite still at hand? Yes. In fact, it's speeding up. I've lost some of that individuatedness. It's that merging is exquisite and beautiful as ever, and it's frankly speeding up, along with the fact that this body dying is speeding up a little. And it was lovely. When I woke the following morning, it was all still going, and again still speeding up a bit.
So if it was a medication thing, it would have wore off, you would have had pain.
Presumably.
You woke up, you'd really need the pain medication,
Right.
for people thinking, oh, he must have been on some good drugs.
Well, first of all, let's be really clear about that. I had left the hospital with a prescription for some very heavy duty narcotic painkillers. That is completely standard practice for this kind of surgery. I had been taking those narcotics. They barely touched the pain. It was like they buffed the tip of the iceberg and left this massive pain that was still present, and just it's like they took the edge off, but boy, was that pain just massive still. And
I'm sorry, would you recommend this surgery to anybody? Because it just sounds horrific.
well, that's why this particular route is, most people are dissuaded from having it. Most sleep medicine doctors try hard not to send their patient in this direction. That was true of me as well. But there was a conference of doctors involved, including my own self and opinion, and it was just clear. I mean, I could tell a story. I don't think it's terribly relevant at this point, but this was a case where all the other solutions just were not. It didn't seem like they were going to work.
So do it or die, huh?
Yeah, it was sort of the only option to solve the problem, or at least that was the conclusion we had all come to. And for the record, I'm grateful for it. And I don't mean grateful just for the NDE. I was grateful for that, but it took a long time to be grateful, which was the point I'll come back to. But there, I did recover from that surgery, and I did, for the first time in my entire adulthood, discover what it was like to have a good night's sleep. And that's a bit of a revelation in its own when you haven't had that experience. And um, I was profoundly grateful for that in the end. It 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 was a net positive. Some of the journey was extraordinarily painful, but let's be clear, that was relatively brief, relatively. And in the end, I also learned how the difference between pain and suffering. That is an awareness that has never fully left me. And it is one that I have applied to other life experiences in a way I don't think I could have without understanding it so clearly. So you're right. For about a week, this was absolute hell in like the most clear possible sense of understanding of that word that we have. It was absolute hell. But there came the moments that I've been describing when that was flipped so completely upside down, for which I'm profoundly grateful. And we'll address this too as we talk, but it took about a decade for me to be fully grateful. But at
Why
the
is
moment,
that? Why did it take so long,
well,
you think?
um, let me explain that in just a moment, and
Okay.
I'll sort
Okay.
of finish the story.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
We'll come right back to it.
I'm too
And
inquisitive.
no, I want you to have all the questions answered. I really do, because I'm sure there are people that will listen to this that have the same questions. And in any case, this is an experience. You asked first about narcotics, and I said yes, they're heavy duty narcotics,
Mhm.
frankly. But what I would emphasize is that, again, this was an experience that took place in a way that was beyond that body. It is the body and the mind in that, literally the brain, the nervous system in that body, that were they affected by narcotics? Yes. But this was an awareness and experience that took place in a way that seemed beyond that body. And that is why the experience, it's my understanding that that's why this experience was so crystal clear. It did not have the fog of those narcotics because those narcotics were in that body. This took place apart from that body.
I get that. Mm.
So it was crystal clear. Um, and it's still going into day 2. And I wake and I again, there's not much to do, but I get my day going, which is like get up and sit in the living room and stare out the windows. It's not a whole lot going on. Um, and again, there's a few insights that come. Again, one of them is that this is speeding up, but I still have some time. If I'm by the time my body really dies completely, it's probably well into the next day. And another one was this sort of reflection on, first of all, how easy it was to die, how much choice I had in the matter, because this doorway was wide open. I could walk through that doorway into that infinite vastness. I could complete this process. It could be allowed to run its course and to merge completely into that infinite oneness. But it was astonishing to see how much of a choice I had in that. I had a clear choice. I could continue in that direction or I could not. And the choice to continue on into it could seem so natural. Like, why wouldn't one naturally bend towards what is the infinite peace of wholeness? It's a very natural choice. And so it's almost more surprising to have the feeling inwardly in that sense of being somewhere that it was simply a thought like, I could totally do that. It would be the easiest thing in the world, but I think I'm just not going to. I just feel like I can't even explain why, but I think I'm not quite done here yet. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what it is I'm supposed to do or what it is that I'm not done with exactly. I think I'm just not quite done yet, and I'm gonna not walk through that doorway yet. And it was a very, very clear choice. This still goes completely unmentioned. I have said nothing to my father. He has no idea I'm dying. And he comes and checks on me periodically. And sometime in the middle of the day, maybe early afternoon or something, he comes in, takes one more look at me, and I see his face sort of purse and his eyes squint and look closely at me. And he just says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we better load up the car and we're going to drive back over to the hospital. That's a 2-hour drive, so it's not a small thing. And in that moment, I look back into his eyes and I think, all right, yeah, let's do it. I mean, I could go this way. I'm 51% on board with sure, Wes, and 49% like, what the hell? I think I'm just going to merge into the wholeness. But it was like 51-49. I was just tipped slightly in favor of, I think I'll stay. That sounds right. Can't explain it. It just sounds right. And I'm not, again, explaining this in detail to my father in any way. I'm just saying, all right, we'll go.
So did you answer him physically?
Yes, I can't recall if it was a whispered word or if it was a nod of my head. Would have been something extremely quiet because this is still a stage in that game where my physical ability to speak is extremely small, and to do so is very painful. So it was either a whispered word or a nod or some combination. But I'd say I was not in a hurry, and I dawdled and took my time, and like, you know, it took forever to get going. And sometime in the mid late afternoon, we're ready to go, and we do go on this 2-hour drive, and we get to
How did he
the
get you out to
ER.
the car?
Well, I'm mobile. I have 2 legs that still work. I can easily walk around. I mean, the damage is all up here. So,
You're like in this state. I'm wondering how you walked and
oh, I just, it's a funny way to put it, but I just walked peacefully. You know, I'm in a great mood at this point. It'd been absolute hell up until the point my body started to die. But from that point forward, I was in the best mood you could imagine. And I still am. And we load up the car and we're driving to the hospital, and I can still barely talk, but I'm trying to whisper out jokes to my dad to make him laugh because I think the whole thing is hilarious and absurd and funny. And I just want to see if I can get him to crack a smile. And he takes me to the ER at Swedish Hospital in Seattle. And very quickly upon being admitted, it's confirmed that my body is dying, and it's dying for the dumbest reason on the planet, which is dehydration, which in retrospect makes all the sense in the world. Um, and it's also a simple fix. And so the ER docs literally, they shake their head and like, what on earth? Why did they kick this kid out of the hospital in this state? Never mind that we're actually in the ER at the same hospital the surgery took place. um, but yeah, they confirm that this person is dying, and my dad finally begins to understand the actual circumstances and is relieved and thrilled that he's pretty sure I just got saved from dying. They connect an IV bag to my arm and dump a liter or two of saline solution fluid into my body, which is the obvious fix. It's the only thing necessary, really. And immediately upon that IV bag being connected, I feel this entire process begin to very gently reverse. I feel that mercury begins to rise again, the life force begins to flow in again, the merging with the infinite reverses as well. I'm beginning to turn and come, back to this very individuated um, place that I'd been used to. And it feels, given the choice that I'd made earlier, like, yeah, I think I do want to be here. And I have some things to do, I think.
It
Not ready
sounds
to
like you were
leave.
dying so slowly.
I was dying slowly. Yeah, I mean, this entire process of seeing what it was like to be dying lasted well over 24 hours, from the day before. By the time I'm in the ER, it's the evening of the next day. Um, it's and so it was a long time to be dying and to hang out with that experience. Quite a long time, really. Um,
For a lot of us, I say a car wreck, a drowning, a surgery, something that's just quick, we have very different experience. And so it's interesting to see one that's dying very slowly,
yes, yes, it was a very slow
right at the
motion car wreck.
threshold.
Right. Um, and I guess, it is kind of a funny thing to say to me, just because all of this was just an experience that came my way. It's not like I had conceived of any of this. I couldn't possibly have conceived of any of this prior to it. It was just
And I
an
imagine that's the
experience
way most
my
people
way.
do die, isn't of a sudden, accident, a sudden illness. It takes about, imagine a lot of people do die very slowly like that and aren't able
Yes.
to communicate what's going on.
Well, yes, I'm sure you're right, first of all. And secondly, from that experience itself, I can understand how someone could be dying and be profoundly, deeply content with looking upon their loved ones, or anyone around them, and not saying a single word. And um, and on the other hand, I have, you know, eventually I came to be in situations as a, as a grown up in this regular world, with other life circumstances, and being around situations where somebody else was dying, and beginning to see some of the extraordinary. I could connect with their experience. I could see that they were beginning to have an experience in their own being, in their own awareness of some of the things that I knew, that I understood. And to see how exquisitely beautiful it was to witness that in someone else, and to see moments, for instance, in which grieving friends and family would come into that room just ready to just implode and lose their minds themselves, and have that person who is dying look upon them and comfort them and say, "Oh, sweetheart, I'll be fine. I'm going to be fine. You will too. I know it's hard right now." And see the one who is dying comforting those who will be remaining, and to
My
understand how
mother-in-law,
that could be.
my mother-in-law, my husband's mom was in that state, and I intuitively knew. And so I got a notepad and pen and I said, let's do a little memoir for you.
Yeah.
And we talked about it in the past. And so she just would stare at the ceiling. I could tell she was seeing exactly
Yeah.
what she's saying. Oh, my daddy used to carry me up in his shoulder. Oh, I could
Mhm.
just feel my daddy up at his neck. And we went to Kresge's and we got him a new coat. And then she talked about her horse and described her horse King. And she just
Mhm.
went through her life up until she got married and having the children. And I noticed she stayed away from the bad places in her life, like when her son died at 5 years old from leukemia. She didn't
Sure.
go there. She
Mhm.
was her favorite memories were coming to
Yeah.
mind. She never looked at me. She would just stare at the ceiling.
Yeah.
And I could tell she was reliving it. And it
Yeah.
dawned on me, I'm walking her home.
Yes, you are. What an honor.
Hmm. It
What an
was.
honor to walk with someone on that pathway to what is the most exquisitely, extraordinarily beautiful walk that they may ever have taken. What an honor to be with them for a moment. Yeah. And, um, people have asked me occasionally lately, because I've never actually told this story publicly until the last few weeks, but so I don't have a lot of, I ended up being around other situations that included matters of death and dying. Those would come to me in just the circumstances of life. They've come around quite a lot. And it always, it made sense to me because I was like, well, yeah, I'm, I'm, I'm actually happy to be here in this situation right now because I feel like I understand it in a way that most people don't. And so it was always, those were always times in which it was just a happy moment of being in service to that situation in a way that felt beautiful. And I felt very lucky and very honored, very blessed, not grieving so much as people might think. And so it began to not be a surprise when kind of frequently other people in situations that included death and dying would sort of show up in my world and want to come to me and talk to me and things like that.
What
But
made you, after 20 years, start talking? I mean, is that the first thing you did was write the article in the newspaper when you come out, or?
um, yeah, well, it wasn't actually published in a newspaper, but it was um, the I guess, gosh, it's a long story. Like, there's 20 plus 22 years between experience and article being released to the world. Uh, and in my case, there's basically, as my father is driving me home from the ER, and he's thrilled because he's just discovered that I was dying and now I'm not. So he's pretty pleased with that. and and I'm reflecting on the way back from the ER as well about how much of what an odd choice, what a curious choice it was to decide, no, I think I'd rather be here than the most beatific, all-encompassing piece that you could imagine. I mean, in a way, that's a funny choice to make. Like, why would you be here where pain seems to like it is real most of the time?
Was your pain gone after that?
Well, it was so immediately upon that reviving um, saline solution drip, I mean, the dehydration problem solved. It just felt like everything worked better. It turns out that being extremely dehydrated makes everything in the body work harder. It makes pain more pronounced. It just wrecks everything. And so with that problem solved, with that, um, the pain levels just came down immensely. And it felt like the healing process just sped up immensely. So from the point of leaving the hospital to just even a few days later, my recovery in general, physically, just felt like it quadrupled. Pain levels came way down. I was capable and able and willing to begin to relearn how to swallow. So, I could be like, listen, I'm going to drink something, I'm going to get this done. We're going to, I'd made the choice. I'm going to be here. I'm not going that way. I'm going to stay here. And, and as a result, it seemed like every little uptick in recovery felt like a kind of a happy achievement, essentially, because that choice had been made. I'm going to stay here, and that it took a little while. I was at the farmhouse for 3 solid weeks, and after 3 weeks, I returned to my own home, and I began to return to the regular workaday world. I was a young guy in the city of Seattle, so of course I worked for some technology company for a little while. uh, and I returned to work, and I had still never imagined, I couldn't figure out how to put any of what I'd experienced into words. That's among the reasons that it took a long time to write about it. I couldn't imagine how to explain to someone that I wasn't my body or that this merging into the infinite business was just even, it was just even more impossible for me to imagine. And so really what happened is I just buried this whole experience. It wasn't, I couldn't forget it. I just didn't talk about it. Not only did I talk about it, or did I not talk about it because it just sounded like I couldn't figure out how to do it without sounding kind of weird, like a weirdo. I couldn't put it into words to begin
I
with anyways,
understand
even though I
that.
wanted to try. But there was another aspect of it, which was that that all-encompassing oneness just felt so impossible to put into words that to even try sort of um, the phrase that I've often used is that it was simply silence was the best vessel for holding it. It was the only way I could feel fully connected to it. As soon as I spoke the words, it was as though I had, because you can't communicate it fully in words, it sort of feels as though it's almost like it's cheapened a little bit or something. I wish I had a better phrase for it, but it felt good to hold it in that silence. It felt
I
full
love that
and rich.
sentence. Silence was the best way of
It
holding
was
it.
the best vessel for holding it.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the way I've
awesome.
often phrased it. And so I could connect with that in silence. And that's just how I chose to hold it. But it was also so mind bending by, the regular framework of mind, like, no, this body is really important. This is me. I mean, that's how I'd gone through most of my life. I was returning to work, to reconcile merging with the infinite to, oh my gosh, I got to get breakfast. I got to get to work. I'm going to be late. Like those are frames of reference that seem so utterly apart and divorced from each other that they're so hard to reconcile that I just felt like I couldn't reconcile them. So I kind of shoved it all into the deep, deep background and spoke not a word of it to anyone, even when they asked. People asked all the time, "Hey, you're back to work. How'd it go? I guess you had a hard recovery, huh?" And oh yeah, it's a big deal. But I would say nothing about the
Right.
fact that these experiences were part of it. Yeah, I almost died. Anyway, glad to be back. You know, um, and and basically the next decade was a period of uh, sort of two very closely related themes regarding this. One was I kept encountering other situations that had to do with death and dying. And that being faced with those situations just kind of forced me to reconcile with my own experience a little more and a little more. And it took a long time. And the other thing that took place, which again, very closely related, was essentially I ended up being what you would have to call a spiritual seeker in a way that I hadn't identified with before. And between these other experiences related to death and dying and a whole host of experiences that were coming my way that I couldn't have imagined or anticipated that are often referred to as spiritually transforming experiences. Um, it was it was a decade of everything I thought I understood about who and what I am being continually broken down and broken down and broken down because I kept going through experiences that showed me something else, something different. That the old framework, the usual perceptual understanding of how the world works, it was just like that just kept getting blown away, bit by bit by bit. And one way you could describe it is saying that those initial experiences and revelations of that NDE ended up sort of being brought back over and over and over until my mind ends up opened enough to have to really grapple with them and acknowledge them and begin to really integrate them. And obviously I'm skipping an enormous number of details here and many, many, many other stories. But I can tell you without any shadow of doubt that many of those experiences that came my way in that next decade were even more transforming. Or I could say, again, sort of forced me to reconcile with the transformations or the revelations that came through that NDE. It was a long process. The core of that transformation revolves around that experience of merging into that oneness. And the core of that experience, if I could put it yet again into attempt to put it into words, was that individuated sense of self, even the non-corporeal sense of self, was shown to be a false construct and would dissolve into this overarching oneness, overwhelming, ineffable wholeness. And in that state of awareness or being, there is no sense of an individuated sense of self. That is an experience that began to appear in my regular daily life. And it was confounding to me on one hand, but also so beatific that, because again, accompanied with that experience is the experience that there was no sense of lack, no sense of need, no sense of want, absolutely no sense of fear. And as a result, its natural default setting was one of just a tremendous, tremendous, simple, joyous peace. And there were really mornings eventually where this experience would sort of waft into my awareness. I mean, I would wake up and this is what I'm experiencing, this is what I'm feeling. And I would sit in the comfy chair in the corner window at my place and I'd think, I just can't think of any reason to go to the office at all today. And at the time I was an entrepreneur running a very small company with a business partner friend, and I'd think, I can't imagine how to explain this to my business partner. That's for sure. And eventually, I might come around and think, well, I guess I'll go to the office. I might not do much, but my business partner, he's there and he'll be wondering if I don't show up.
So did this experience linger and has stayed with you?
That experience of no sense of self, no individuated sense of self, began to sort of wave in and out. And when it was in, it was just, it's best encapsulated by simply saying a tremendous and overwhelming, joyful, quiet peace. It would move, I mean, that would waver out, and it would, in its wake, I would feel a combination of awe and utter bafflement. Like, what is going on here? And frequently it would kind of swing, the pendulum would swing all the other way to abject panic. Like, what the hell is going on here? Am I really thinking about not going to the office? Because it's not like I don't have a mortgage. What am I doing?
Did it feel like a battle between the soul and the mind?
I probably would have, if I had to put it in those kinds of terms, I would have said, I don't know what I would have said. It was a battle though. It was. And in those deeply fearful moments, that peace was so distant, and seemed so hard to figure out and find. And like, part of me just desperately wants to get back there, but I can't figure out how to do it. If I try to force it to happen, that doesn't work at all. in those moments of overwhelming peace, that fear is just utterly and completely released. And it's almost as though they made each other worse, because once you know one side, it makes the other one worse. Or once you know the other side, it makes the other one so beatifically better that it's just, oh my gosh. And so there began to be this tension between the two that that brought about in me what I would describe as the core of spiritual seeking. I began the tension between those two began to drive me to get it resolved. There was this part of me that was like, I have got to understand this. I must figure this out. This has got to be resolved. And that drive became absolutely, absolutely ferocious, to the point that I did eventually do some things that look, well, they're the kinds of things that you find in spiritual stories of eventually this, I felt like my actual life was actually falling apart. And by the way, nobody knows this. I don't speak outwardly about any of it in any way. It wasn't my nature. As usual, I felt like I couldn't explain it. So this tremendous, ferocious drive is happening, but when I show up at the office, I don't talk about it. I have no one in my circles. It wasn't, I'm not saying that to, it's just to paint the picture as it really was.
I get
I'm
that.
not part of a group or
I get that.
there's no teachers or whatever. It's
Right.
just
Where do
it's
you
just a
find the
thing.
answers?
Right. And, I did some reading, lots of reading, some of which was helpful, some of which was irrelevant. Um, the best source that I found for myself, and I'm very clear that this would not be true for everyone, but there's a work called A Course in Miracles. It's a big, thick book. Uh, I became a fan of it because it helped me understand my own experience more than anything else I'd come across. So that was helpful, but there's still, this is sort of happening in otherwise in essentially in a social vacuum. And but it really is ferocious. And it gets to the point where I just feel like life is falling apart. And this is obviously still a process of many years as well. And at 39 years old, 10 years after that NDE, I ditch everything and I disappear and I walk completely away from, you might call it ordinary adulthood. And I I sell I sell my half of the biz back to my business partner. I ditch my business. I sell my car. I say goodbye to the lovely girlfriend. I give the keys to my home to someone I barely know, and I disappear. And the that seeking had become so ferocious that I could not say no. At that time, and it's going to sound a little over dramatic to me, anyways. But at the time, this was, I am going to resolve this or I will die trying.
It sounds like you need to finish dying.
I will, if this, I will, I will put death on the table. I will put homelessness on. I don't care. I have ditched absolutely everything, and 1000% of my focus goes on this, and I will resolve it. I don't know if it's possible, if that's even possible. I don't know if I'm embarking on something that is absolutely mad, but I know that I cannot not do this. And I will I will sit with this and I will work it out or I will die trying. Sounds a little overdramatic to me now, but it was that ferocious essentially. And my method for doing that was to disappear. I I knew I needed to go somewhere that was quiet, where I would be solitary, and where I could live so cheaply that I could do it for a reasonably extended period of time. And so I disappeared to a tiny little roadless village, only accessible by boat, in the western highlands of Guatemala. And for the record, I didn't speak Spanish. And this little village was so remote that they don't speak Spanish there either. They speak an ancient Mayan dialect
Isn't that
where,
interesting? The
yes,
Mylans.
yes, Spanish is their second language in this village. And I sat and I did what a good Zen Buddhist would say I was doing, self-inquiry. And what that meant for me was to write. I wrote and wrote and wrote, and I was going to deconstruct all these experiences and deconstruct everything I could by writing through it, like writing it out. And the prime directive of that writing, as I came to hear the, sort of in that inner prompt, was I was going to deconstruct fear. I was going to have to go into my own fear and dig at it and dig at it and dig and dig and dig and dig until I got absolutely to the absolute bottom of it. That was the task I set, because it seemed the only way
Dig into fear.
to dig into my own fear and dig, like, what is it? Where did it come from? What's going on here? What's really true about this? What's really, really true? And sort of take this sword of discernment and cut and cut and cut and cut and cut. And that took months. And one of the portions of what became a couple hundred pages of journaling, nearly a couple hundred pages, was the eventually I came down, as I dug through all the layers of fear that I could, I came to essentially two recognitions within myself that I happen to believe, I came to believe very quickly, were very universal as part of the human experience, is that there are two of the deepest fears that we have, the most basic fears that we have, and they're really the same thing. I'm calling them two things, even though they're really one thing. But number one happens to be the fear of abandonment, and number two happens to be the fear of death. And essentially, they're the same thing, because the fear of abandonment is essentially the fear of death. But so there came a point in this journaling where it became meaningful for me to write about and break down everything in my experience relating to death and dying. So it was impossible for me not to return to that near-death experience and journal it out, and return to the handful of other experiences in my adulthood at that point that had to do with death and dying. So I wrote all these things out, and that journal excerpt 10 years later became the article that was published a month ago.
How did it get published?
It's on a blog platform called medium.com.
Okay.
And I've ended up with a little website of my own. It's published there. It's also published in a download. It's kind of a long article, which is why most other outlets, it wasn't quite the format. It was
Do you want to leave
so
your website?
sure. The website is assistthespirit.com.
Okay.
That's my little website, and it's a place where this article is easily found, along with a handful of other articles I've written. And it's also a place where, anyone, if they want to, they can come find me there and write me a note, and I will respond.
What do you do
happy to
now?
do that.
I mean, did you return to life? Are you still in your?
I never returned to life fully in the way that I left. I never did, and the reason for that is that I went through, I'd say, the most transformative doorway of all during that time. As a result of a number of experiences there that came out of this self-inquiry, this process that ended up being life-changingly transformative in a way that original NDE kind of pointed towards. But again, at that time with the NDE, I mostly buried that experience. It took all these years in between to kind of reconcile with it. But the doorway that I went through during this long period of intense, silent, personal retreat was the doorway that transformed the way I see and understand and perceive and move through the world in a way that was so upending that it took years to get used to, actually. And the core of that transformation is what I've been alluding to throughout this conversation, which is there is this core sense that individuated sense of a personal self was a false construct and didn't have real reality, and in fact could fall away completely. For years before my retreat, as I described, there was this period of years where that experience would sort of waver in and out, which was, maddening in a way. But there was a time during this retreat where that sense simply permanently took root and has never ever left, ever.
Do you
And
have to stay in
sometimes
solitude to keep that?
no, not
Okay.
remotely. It is with me in this moment right here as we speak. It has never left.
But I mean, do you spend a lot of time in solitude?
I have historically spent quite a lot of time in solitude. I'm still a bit of a fan of it, but it's not required at all.
Yeah.
I, so that sense of the lack of an individuated sense of personal self, the freedom that confers still remains with me. It's why it feels beautiful. It's also why it's possible to be in touch with that experience, that there is no lack, no want, no sense of need, that everything is essentially whole and one, that the body, as useful as it appears to be, is itself ultimately not that important, frankly. It is essentially an illusory experience that, well, we might as well do what we can with it and be useful while it appears to be a thing. But when it comes time for that body to be laid aside, I can assure you without the slightest iota of concern, it will be laid aside, and I will feel absolutely no sense of grief or loss.
Now I'm to understand you don't have wife, children, that kind of thing.
I don't. I'm kind of surprised to report that. It's not like there haven't been opportunities to have those parts of life. But I have people in my life that are deeply loved and important to me that that I'm just delighted to have in my life. I'm kind of surprised to report I don't have kids, but I can just say, and you've obviously gotten somewhat of a sense of this, but the journey I've taken has just been, it's been full in other ways that have just not, the sort of typical householder life of family and kids were not something that needed to be a part of it, essentially. I mean, that's how I
My
look upon it.
40-year-old son, Nathan, he hasn't dated in, gosh, 20 years. He likes his solitude. He works, saves money. He doesn't socialize. He just chooses that kind of existence.
I've certainly I've been in beautiful relationships, and but here's we're at the risk of getting far afield into interesting but possibly way off topic conversations. There is so much about the way that most of us as humans approach relationship and love that has to do with deeply fear-based patterns and drives. And I don't want to, try to paint some picture that I'm somehow beyond all the machinations of being human, but it is still true that a vast majority of those kinds of fear-related drives just dropped away in a way that there's just no, if you take those things away, then many of the underpinnings of what most people understand as relationship and love also kind of fall apart, frankly. It's still tremendously freeing to be able to look at someone and feel just overwhelmingly loving, but not feel
Ownership.
yes, that's one of many words that that could apply. It's it's very freeing to me, and from my point of view, it's very freeing to them. But that sense of freedom, that sense of oneness, that sense of a lack of an individuated sense of self is something that it's always there, and it sort of context matters. So sometimes it's more in the background, sometimes it's more in the foreground. When I'm putting gas in my car, it's in the background. It's there. It's just I'm putting gas in my car, having a cup of tea. Like ordinary life happens, you know. And one of the things that's true about tremendous oneness and allness is that it contains everything, including the mundane, like paying bills.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I have an appointment. I want to go see my sister, nursing home. So I'm going to need to
Wonderful.
rush.
All right.
And she's having a
Well,
Christmas party today, and actually supposed to be
we'll
there right now.
we'll wrap it
I
up.
forgot about
We'll
it.
wrap it up. We will
Okay.
absolutely wrap it up. But I my my ultimate reason for talking to you today is to, in some, perhaps even if it's in a small way, offer anyone who might be listening to this a window into that same peace. And from my perspective, this is the sort of peace and the sort of truth that, even though most of us don't feel deeply connected to it, but nobody gets to avoid the truth forever. It is in each and every one of us. That's the nature of wholeness. And I hope that through this, anyone listening gets to touch it a little, bring it a little bit more into their own life, including you and your sister. And I hope you go have a fantastic Christmas party.
Thank you. It's nice talking to you.
Likewise,
All right.
Peggy.
Uh-huh.
Peace.
Bye-bye.